been a long time since I was here, and I feel like I'd be letting the side down if I didn't somehow extend the aeroplane metaphor, except that the only phrase that came to mind as I was trying to come up with something pithy and spontaneous 10 minutes ago was flying by the seat of my pants. I'm speaking from notes, but and I'm aware as well that we've got, I mean, because I'm scheduled to finish in 10 minutes, but yeah, okay, good, that's good to know. So I will start by returning to our signature phrase, really, for this exhibition, for this symposium. What will they see of me? Well, the emergence of the internet, or the digital revolution, gave rise immediately to a utopian fantasy of virtual selfhood. The fantasy is familiar to us all. A fantasy that circulated among cultural theorists and media commentators and a kind of nebulous populace alike. The fantasy is that a dematerialized self that is liberated from the constraints of any fixed modality of identity, bodily, characterological, gender, floats freely through the measureless ether. Its multitude of desires and identifications no longer constrained by the straitjacket of being one person in particular. As Lawrence Scott, and I don't know if anybody here knows, well, you probably won't know his work. It's the winner, actually, of the Jerwood Literary Prize, but it's not yet been published. But in his forthcoming book, The Four-Dimensional Human, he points out that things haven't quite worked out this way, that a very different and distinctly non-utopian history of virtual selfhood has unfolded, in which the self, instead of being deliriously liquefied or vaporized, has petrified, has turned to stone. It turns out, as though we didn't know it already, that consumer capitalism doesn't like the liquid, disembodied self we once dared to imagine. And with our active collusion, has overlain it with an atrophied, quantified self that makes us much easier to sell stuff to, that facilitates the book and the restaurant and the concert recommendations and the financial products and the medical plans, which feed me back images of the sum of my wishes and needs and anxieties. So what, other than the pseudo-intimacy of this algorithmic knowledge of my consumer preferences, what do I gain from this petrifaction? What makes this reflection of ourselves as this integral sum of data, sealed by the headshot that represents me to the world, what makes it so seductive? Why would I want to be petrified? And why would I want to so much invert the original fantasy of virtual selfhood? Well, this ossified version of our digital double makes us knowable to ourselves, albeit at the expense of the excess, the remainder, the otherness of the private self. So to the question, what will they see of me? It answers that they will see an integral, remainderless outline, discernible as a discrete whole. They will see a set of clearly differentiated contexts, allaying the menacing anxiety that I might dissolve imperceptibly into the infinite void of the virtual landscape. Virtual capitalism is premised on the ruthless maintenance of a regime of positive seeing. A tracking, measuring pervasive gaze that sets me in place, that contains the spills, the contingencies of everyday selfhood. It's hostile to regions of greyness, of ambiguity, of undifferentiation, to the whatever it is of me that it can't see, that it can't drag into its fluorescent daylight. Now, it's hard here not to think of the deliriously prolific output of Andy Warhol, including the ongoing performance of his own self, obsessively reproducing, apparently obsessively reproducing this regime of seeing, the abstracted surfaces of consumer culture. What he calls Americanness is the reduction of experience to the drone of equalizing indifference that we hear actually in his voice, or see in the one-shot point of view of his films. Just play it all on one level, he writes, although that writes would have to be in scare quotes. He is ghost-written in his philosophy of Andy Warhol. I'm reminded when we quote "just play it all on one level" of that Oscar selfie, because of the young man on the right-hand side, who has the same glasses as me, but the resemblance ends there. Because he's just somebody's brother. He's the brother of the actress who actually won the Oscar, who's almost completely obscured in the background. And he's there in the foreground, starring, but he has no reason to be there. Unless, of course, we think of the image as a kind of emanation of this sensibility of absolute indifference, of playing it all on one level. All paintings, he opines at one point in the same book, all paintings should be the same size and colour to iron out the kinks of differentiation and desire. He says, as soon as you have to decide and choose, it's wrong. Warhol's indifference is the insinuation of what I'm going to call the neutral into the regime of positive visibility, of Coke, of Campbell's soup, of movie stars, or of Mao. It discloses the undertow of greyness that secretly conditions the positivity of consumer vision, that pulls its can-do optimism into the realm of undifferentiated inertia and unmeaning. I think here as well of the great Ed Ruscha series of liquid words, where words which often have resonances of consumer slogans are painted in one kind of viscous liquid or another and shot, but one sees them at the threshold, really, of congealing into a kind of sticky, liquefied mass, where meaning is just about to turn into a kind of sticky, dense thingliness. Beautiful and terrifying. Well, Roland Barthes, in the 1978 course that he delivered at the Collège de France just 2 years before he died, Roland Barthes names this undifferentiated region that subtends our waking lives, the neutral, le neutre. The neutral, he writes at the beginning of this course from 79, is what baffles the paradigm. Okay, it's a wonderful phrase, what baffles the paradigm. So the paradigm is the opposition of two virtual terms. So I suppose one would say in common parlance that the paradigm is binary thinking. The paradigm is what allows us to differentiate. It is what sets one thing against another, that allows us to identify, to render one thing distinct from another. Neutrality, in Barthes' language, is the neutralizing of this differentiated surface. It's kind of congealing into and a kind of indifference. A kind of undertow of indistinction into which the apparent clarity of the world is always threatening to be pulled, a lassitude, an inertia which fails to hold up the apparent world of waking life, letting it collapse. There is, I think, a resonance here of the great kind of announcement or proclamation of Nietzsche in Twilight of the Idols, who announces the abolition of the real world. And he says, we have abolished the real world. What is left? Just the world of appearances? He says, no. Once we abolish the real world, we abolish the apparent world as well. Well, this, I think, the zone of neutrality, of undifferentiation, is the zone into which these two films, that in so many ways, transport us. In a publicity interview, the hotel room serves as the neutral background that allows the foreground to appear. So I don't know if this is yours, but I'm going to drink it. It is the neutral background that allows the foreground to appear. Its purpose is to occlude itself, to provide the invisible frame for the content of the interview. Its anonymity gives us the sense of the celebrity's ubiquity, because it locates her not in a place, but in place itself, in a generalized everywhere and nowhere of mass media transmission. Now, to bring in yet another set of concepts, what is the Freudian uncanny, if not the sudden intrusion of this unperceived mute condition of the visible into the surface of perception? The familiar, in Freud's famous essay, the familiar becomes unfamiliar by disclosing its secret and obscure conditions, that which we never usually see as our gaze is making its way through the waking world. The hotel room in Lucy's film creeps me out. Why? Simply because it asks to be seen as a thing among things. It renounces, the hotel room renounces its own discretion. It suddenly refuses to be invisible. It hosts all kinds of interactions, and the point is that, like any good host, it is meant to be discreet, to disappear obligingly into the background. The non-place isn't meant to become a place. It's meant to remain obligingly imperceptible, subservient to the scene that's projected onto it, or that is staged in it. The weightless glamour of celebrity culture takes on the smell of stale air, of inertia in Lucy's film. Isn't the star interview exemplary of the paradigm in Barth's sense? It is a language which preserves the differentiations of the daylit world. It confirms a particular kind of regime of positive seeing. It preserves it from any breach, or what Barth would call baffling. And kind of allied to this, of course, is the function of these very tight and sometimes kind of violently defensive publicity machines. They are about the preservation of a particular brand, of an identity that can't be unfixed on pain of losing its profitability. Now, the irony of the avatar for me from our own correspondent is that, for all her brazen artifice and comical lack of realism, she is the film's repository of awkward humanity. She is the intrusion of neediness, of desire, of the way in which the smooth habits of the publicity industry fray at the edges. So this sense of kind of her loneliness in this very lonely place, exposes the neutral that wants filling in, the kind of the void that that something like celebrity culture kind of compulsively fills in. The interviewer is the usually unseen mediator between the star and her audience. As a mediator, she's meant to vanish. This one kind of intruding into the surface of the screen in ways that are actually, to use that word again, quite baffling. She is heavy with a kind of thick, dense presence. I enjoyed reading Alice's blog in all kinds of ways on the show, but I'm thinking here of Lucy talking about the ways in which she was brought up by the interviewers that appear in the film for her amateurism, for the nods that make her too present, that foil the interviewer's seductive ruse of disappearing into her question. If the avatar is a figure for the artist, for Lucy, or for any artist, for the creator who insinuates herself into her creation, even when seeking to efface herself. We might, of course, also be speaking of Lally here, who, after all, occupies the centre of the oneric landscape into which Isabel is parachuted in the course of her anaesthetised psychic journey into her own nasal passage. The severely rugged beauty of the northern Albanian landscape manifests in Lally as a baffling of its own paradigm. The positive charge of manliness, pulled into the neutrality of the neither-or, or the both-and, a being suspended between an accursed femininity and an empty masculinity. One modality of the neutral, writes Barth, and I love this. Barth's course is wonderful to read for all kinds of reasons. One of the main ones for me is that he pulls all kinds of bizarre marginalia from kind of the great names of Western and Eastern thought. So he writes these kind of pithy aphoristic paragraphs that usually are kind of headed by adjectives. And he has a kind of aphoristic paragraph called limp. One modality of the neutral is that which is disdained in a dominant culture as limp. He quotes the paragon of German idealist self-certainty, Fichte. Fichte rails against what he calls the limp mode of knowledge and the limp person who embodies it. Fichte clearly doesn't like limpness. So this is what Fichte says about limpness. In his fake being, limp, distended, multiple, there are a crowd of antitheses, of contradictions that live peaceably side by side. Nothing in him is either distinct or separated, but everything is mixed, everything is interlaced. They neither love nor hate, because for gratitude, for love, for hatred, for each feeling, there must be this energetic concentration of which they are incapable, because it requires that we distinguish and separate within the diversity. So, if we think of idealist philosophy as the kind of the great moment in which the Western tradition tries to enthrone certainty and distinctness as the great unimpeachable value, then of course indifference, greyness becomes the great enemy, indecision becomes the great enemy. So Barth in his gloss on Fichte notices the equation of loving with choosing, which actually, again, for me, evokes Warhol, who, of course, envisions some horizon of art in which one wouldn't choose anything, in which one would, the purpose of producing art would in fact be to create a kind of completely undifferentiated landscape in which everything is reduced to a level. But loving, says Barthes, in Fichte's universe is equated with choosing, which is, he says, a gesture which destroys the remainder, that conflates a multitude of desires with indecision. So this tendency to indecision or to float between possibilities is denounced by Fichte as softness, as limpness. It also makes me think, actually, of Freud, another person who likes at times to appear as a kind of paragon of self-certainty, but at the same time who is always subjecting himself, his mind, his thinking, to forces which radically undermine that self-certainty. And this happens from the beginning. This happens not just at the level of the theoretical, but the clinical. He's constantly confronted with clinical phenomena that, if you like, render him limp. That is, that they kind of baffle his existing paradigms. And in the face of this rush of blood, which is so kind of wonderfully reimagined in Marianna's film, as a kind of flood of tissue, of red tissue. But the letter from Emma Eckstein that is voiced over the letter from Freud that is voiced over the image of the flooding red tissue, is of course Freud describing himself nearly fainting as this blood rushes kind of unstoppably from Emma Eckstein's nose. This is a botched operation that Freud kind of colluded with, not wanting to see what was really happening to the patient. And Freud is basically describing a kind of descent into limpness. Lally, on the other hand, is far from limp. There is an immense, intimidating concentration involved in maintaining her suspended condition, a kind of tautness in her tenacious cleaving to the neutral space, for she can't slip into the pre-legislated roles of either the enduring sap that is a woman or the phantasmic phallic authority of the man. What we might say is that she exposes a kind of limpness at the heart of identity itself, a fragility, a precariousness in the identities into which we imagine we can disappear without remainder. What is interesting about the blood feud that Lally tells us would ensue were she to betray her renunciation of womanhood is that it works to uphold this space of the neither nor, the baffling of the paradigm. It punishes a reversion to the easy seductions of identity. Blood, in other words, the substance, and Marianna's film, is not the sealant of sex or ethnicity or some other modern fixation, but its solvent. It is the solvent of identity. It's the sign of the baffling rather than the enforcement of the paradigm. It is striking how easily psychoanalysis has served as both instrument of patriarchy and agitator against it. Is it simply a matter of different interpretations? The Oedipus complex is one interpretation, a patriarchal instrument, because it states in advance the boy or girl's place in the triangle of what Deleuze and Guattari call mummy, daddy, me. It points us to the relation which, as boy or girl, we are already taking up, viz. Sexuation, sex. But Oedipality is simultaneously the exposure of the precariousness of these positions, the ways in which being a girl or being a boy so flagrantly fails to resolve and stabilize the multiplicity of our desires and identifications. We fantasize that virtual disembodiment would relieve the flows of desire, a la Deleuze and Guattari and Hart and Negri, that digital capitalism would announce an explosion of the flows of desire, only to find that in so many ways it dams up the flows of the desire. This is what, as I see it, the anti-Oedipal theory fails to appreciate. It doesn't want to believe that the human being resists and inhibits and indeed represses its own flows of desire. We might ask, apropos this debate, why it is that the Snowden revelations, for all the shock they induce, have so signally failed to trigger any sustained popular protest, or even, let's face it, much sustained popular interest. The superficial and rather condescending psychologizing that this question often gives rise to, something like, oh, it's too complicated, or it's too abstract, or there's nothing in it ordinary people can relate to, it's too middle class, it's too techie. This misses, I think, the complex and contradictory role of fantasy in these debates. The fantasy conjured by privacy activists are well known to us all. And I'm, in a way, elaborating on something that Stephen started to develop in his introduction. Big Brother has us in his sights, is tracking our every move, is recording and storing our every transaction, is keeping a permanent digital record of our youthful follies, of our shaming secrets. But it is worth recalling the not coincidentally named Oedipus Maas's thought in Pynchon's classic Crying of Lot 49, that the only more terrifying possibility than the paranoid scenario that everything's connected is the anti-paranoid scenario that nothing is connected. This is, after all, only good psychoanalysis. Paranoia, says Freud, is not the illness, it is the attempt at its solution. It is the psyche's sewing of a patch, of a rend in the fabric of reality. In other words, the psyche can envision no more profound catastrophe than a void of representation, than the abolition of the world, because it must mean the abolition of myself. So it will not tolerate gaps, tears in the real, in the fabric of the real. Is this why anxieties about the permanence of the digital record fail to resonate with or agitate the popular imagination? Does the superegoic god of surveillance appeal too much to the core of our infantile helplessness, to the wish for a guiding authority that resolves the question of who we are by telling us? The alternative, after all, is my disappearance into the unnavigable flood of data generated at every second. That is, my consignment to the indifference of the neutral, rather than the differentiated object of an all-seeing eye. Might our rage to exhaust every form of the celebrity's visibility have something to do with this, with the suspicion that something is always being withheld, rendered inaccessible to us? Precisely because the online world allows us to cultivate maximal ambiguity, multiplicity, strangeness, precisely because it can engender infinite ways of unknowing myself, it provokes what a classical Freud would call a reaction formation, of shoring up my self-knowledge, of finding ways to fix myself rigidly in place. I am speaking as a strong supporter of privacy campaigners, but that can't prevent us from noticing that the image of the self under state and corporate surveillance that is disseminated by privacy campaigners is always an object to be possessed, exploited, manipulated. The importance, I think, of the writer's petition, the petition of, well, initially about 500 and it's growing, but a global writer's petition for privacy, is that it framed the issue as one of imaginative freedom. That is, it made a case for a region or a non-region of the self that escapes all surveillance. This cannot be possessed or destroyed, as Ai Weiwei, among many others, has shown us, but it can certainly be attacked. What is being attacked? Something like this neutral, that is, the ambiguity or uncanniness in us that agitates because it's what we're not meant to see. It's what's meant to dissolve invisibly into the paradigm. Freud had a strange relation to art. On the one hand, he was rather condescending about it. Art, he recognizes, enjoys a certain intimacy with the unconscious, to the extent that it cannot step back from its unconscious conditioning to be able to understand it or to master it. But on the other hand, Freud's relation to art is also one of almost explicit envy, the sense that in handing the unconscious over to science, psychoanalysis' relation to it becomes one of lost intimacy, becomes one of alienation from the unconscious. Except that, at times, the unconscious insinuates itself into this distant scientific objectivity. Indeed, this is what psychoanalysis is, science discovering the opaque, incomprehensible conditions of what makes it possible to comprehend. Psychoanalysis, like these films, is weird, it is creepy, it is disturbing because it is possessed, it is taken over by what it thought it had mastered. In The Uncanny Essay, Freud writes, psychoanalysis is thinking become uncanny. That is, it is not a thinking of the uncanny, it is not a distance theorizing of the uncanny, but it's the uncanny taking over, possessing thinking itself. The Department of Employment encourages us to use social media to build our brand, to make the world see of me what I want them to see of me. Amazon and the rest encourage me to share my consumer preferences so that the world can see of me what I want them to see of me. But the voided or bloodied landscape of selfhood in these films that spills the bounds of quantification, of measurement, of discrete visibility, remind us that what they see of me is never up to me.